By 1964, the Beatles had become a cultural phenomenon. A Hard Day's Night, both the album and film had solidified them as global icons. Musically, they were evolving at an astounding rate, faster than any other band before them. In such a short time, they'd gone from playing skiffle rock and roll covers in Hamburg to now crafting sophisticated compositions that redefined the way pop music was written. In almost every sense, they had set the blueprint for their musical contemporaries. But the group were exhausted. Life had become a cycle of touring, interviews and studio recording. A Hard Day's Night had been out just 2 months when the Beatles regrouped and headed back into EMI studios. They felt they had to keep up the formula of releasing 2 records a year. The problem was, the pace they were on was beginning to take a toll on them musically. Every new composition John and Paul were putting forward for consideration sounded weak. They even considered putting off for sale until their material was up to scratch. But it was now the group's songs would showcase a new level of emotional depth. John, by this point, was feeling the strain of fame. In truth, he was beginning to feel trapped by the expectations placed on him. Paul, on the contrary, embraced the chaotic schedule the Beatles were held to. He enjoyed playing the diplomat of the group. He was also feeling a kind of vindication. The Beatles had broke America. Their success was rising by the week. It was undeniable evidence the group weren't just a passing fad, just as Paul had always believed. George was beginning to feel frustrated with the media's obsession with groups' personal lives rather than just their music. Of all the 4, being a celebrity never sat easy with George, and repetitive interviews annoyed him to no end. This year, we'll see George Martin's dictatorship over the Beatles begin to slip. The Beatles' first live album will be recorded, and they'd squeeze out an entire studio album in between touring. This is the story of the Beatles for sale.
Okay.
August 11th, the Beatles returned to EMI Studios to begin work on their next album. George Martin as producer, with studio engineer Norman Smith, and in later recordings, Geoff Emerick assisting. In Geoff Emerick's place for the earlier sessions, Mike Stone and Ron Pender sat. There were 2 new young recruits, and to gain the most experience, they'd been thrown to George and Norman. Each day, George Martin as ever arrives at EMI wearing a suit. He liked being an authoritarian figure. Geoff Emerick recorded him as a man who always knew exactly what he wanted. George got on with Geoff so well because he kept his thoughts to himself. The last thing George Martin wanted was an opinionated worker in the control room. Through the entire time they worked together, there was never much conversation between George and Geoff, but they could read each other's thoughts. Their instincts when working were very similar. In Studio 2 at 7 AM in the morning, they begin work on John's composition Babies in Black. The song is believed to be inspired by Stuart Sutcliffe's fiancée, Astrid Kircher. The woman in the song grieves the loss of her loved one. With no interest in moving on, she rejects the love of another man. On this day, the group run through 14 takes. They play loud in the studio, as they always did. John especially was always turning up the volume on his amp. George Harrison would turn up his to match. This would always lead to overload problems with the mics that were positioned close to the amps. George Martin or Norman Smith would always tell them to turn the amps down. When John was playing guitar, he would always hit the strings hard, causing them to break, as opposed to George. For the vocals, John and Paul decide, in order to give a closeness to the song, they'll sing their parts into the same microphone simultaneously. This left some with confusion as to which the main melody was, Paul's high harmony or John's low. Paul would tell people at the time they're both the main melody. 3 days later, the group returned to the studio and begin work on 3 new compositions. First being John's composition, I'm a Loser. The song details a man's struggle with his own self-image. John was the most complex of all the Beatles. The others had a more consistent personality. You knew what to expect. John, not so much. John, a lot of the time, was in a good mood in the studio. He could be funny, kind and charming, though when his mood changed, it was written all over his face and it could change in an instant. Then it could change back in an instant. The best course of action was to stay away if he was in a bad mood. In the studio, John wore glasses, but they never seemed to help his eyesight much. He would always be staring vacantly, squinting his eyes. I'm a Loser was new territory for the group. The song was a big shift in direction from their teeny bop hits. Never before had they been so self-deprecating and so honest. With a shortage of compositions, John and Paul decided to add some of their cover songs, all of which they perform in their stage show. The first being Roy Lee Johnson's hit, Mr. Moonlight. The song was often their opening number when they performed live. The crowd knew this and would wait for John to hit the first scream of Mr. It was no easy task for John. There was no instrumentation preceding it to keep him in tune, and he would have to hit it just right from nothing. In the song, the narrator thanks the moon being a metaphor for God or some mystical force, for watching over him and bringing love into his life. It takes John a few tries to nail the vocal. 4 takes are recorded, with the 4th marked as the best. For the solo, John wanted George Harrison to mimic the tremolo guitar used in the original. It was attempted, but George Martin felt it sounded too weird. Instead, Paul played a Hammond organ to bad effect. Mixes are made for both Mr. Moonlight and I'm a Loser that day. These won't be the final mixes though, they'll redo them later in October. To this day, fans look back on Mr. Moonlight as their least favourite song of the album. The last song they begin that day, another cover titled Leave My Kitten Alone, first written by Little Willie John. During takes, John stops and says, "I wish I could sing this without playing." They go through 5 takes, but are very unhappy with the results. They decide to scrap it. The song will later feature in Anthology 1. 9 days later, the Beatles perform at the Hollywood Bowl in California. The performance is recorded for a new album to be released by Capitol. George Martin is strongly against the idea. The Beatles don't care either way. On a free track, 29 minutes of the band performing live are recorded. George Martin is in attendance and suggests the 2 tracks be assigned for the instruments and the 3rd track just for the vocals. The problem is, he has no say in the matter, being a foreigner. The engineers record the band in a very strange way. Both instruments and voices are recorded together, and they intentionally pick up the screaming fans. To make matters worse, the Beatles couldn't hear themselves singing as the Fold speakers weren't working. With the end result, the sound quality is so bad, both Capitol and the Beatles decide to shelve it. Records were later given to George Martin and Jeff Emerick to mix in 1977. The 2 would skillfully mix the recordings and add other recordings taken at the venue a year later. The album is released as The Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl. Just under a month later, on September 29th, the Beatles return to EMI to continue recording. They go through 3 songs that day. The first track they begin, Paul's composition, Every Little Thing. A simple story of gratitude. In the song, the narrator voices his appreciation for his partner. Paul had wrote the song in Jane Asher's parents' basement at the time. John later confirmed Paul had written it and he added minimal. It was on one of these rare occasions that the composer of the songs didn't actually sing the lead. Paul joins John for the chorus, where his voice is more prominent. John would take the verse for this song, and Paul joined with the chorus, with his voice being more prominent. Paul was very much like George Martin in that he was a person who knew exactly what he wanted. He always got his way, though through diplomacy rather than force. John, on the other hand, was thick-skinned. He was always open to others' ideas. Paul couldn't take criticism. They go through 4 takes that day, with 4 being deemed the best. This song, Paul had originally intended to be the Beatles' next single. It wasn't as good as anticipated and was resigned as another album track. The second song that began that day, John's composition, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. Continuing John's theme of self-deprecation, the song details a man stood up at a party. A strong theme runs throughout of humiliation. That day, they go through 19 takes, with the 19th one chosen. George Harrison adds a country rock solo and John strums acoustic, most likely his Gibson. The third and final song the group begin, Paul's composition, What You Doing. The song documented the turbulent relationship of Paul and Jane Asher. The narrator is frustrated with his partner for treating him coldly. Paul was never keen on the song. He dismissed it as a bit of filler for the album. The band nor Paul has ever performed the song live. On this day, only the backing track is recorded. They will continue adding vocals the next day. 30th of September, the Beatles return to EMI and finish off Every Little Thing, as well as Paul's song What You Doing. After that, they continue with John's composition No Reply. Another melancholy song, the narrator desperately tries to contact his love interest, to which he's ignored. The song deals with themes of rejection. John had written it earlier in the year when he and George went on holiday to Tahiti, but with an absence of material, John had decided to use the song. This song was a candidate for the group's next single. When they lay down the vocals, John's voice is shot from all the singing of the day. He struggles to hit the high notes, and as a solution, Paul decides to do them, merging his voice with John's. John and Paul always had blocks of time devoted to writing together. They would often do it at John's attic at Kenwood. One time, Paul was being chauffeur driven over. Sat in the back, he began some small talk with the driver. Paul asked, "How have you been?" To which the man replied, "Oh, working hard, working 8 days a week." At that point, a bell went off in Paul's head. When he arrived at Kenwood and John answered the door, Paul blurted out, "I've got this title, 8 days a week." It encapsulated their whole life during this period. John loved it, and they dashed up to the attic and began throwing out lyrics. John would later slate the song, stating it was never any good. Side note, it's worth mentioning Paul also stated he got the title off Ringo, saying he said it like an overworked chauffeur. He later went back on these comments and confirmed on the documentary 8 Days a Week the former story of an actual chauffeur giving him the title was true. On the 6th of October, the group returned to EMI to record 8 Days a Week. The song wasn't complete yet though. It was the first time an incomplete song was brought in to experiment with. The song would develop as the takes went on, with the oohs being added on take 2 and evolving from there. In between takes of the song, John begins working out the guitar for the song I Feel Fine. 2 days later, they return to the studio to begin work on Paul's composition She's a Woman. The song tells the story of a strong, independent woman who refuses to conform to expectations. They run through 7 takes, but there's not much progression from take 1 to the final take. The song will not be used for the album, but will appear as the B-side of the group's next single. 2 days later, the Beatles set off on a tour across England. They will be forced to cram in remaining sessions on their days off. On the 18th of October, the group returned to EMI. Geoff Emerick is in attendance as studio engineer for the first time on this album. They first begin on their next cover song, Little Richard's Kansas City Hey Hey. The story, a simple tale of a man's excitement to travel to Kansas City and meet his love interest. The group have been playing this song live ever since their Hamburg days. The song was one of Paul's favourite. While rehearsing the song, Paul struggles with the vocals. John pulls him aside and says, "Come on man, you can do it better than this. Get up there." Paul regroups and nails the vocal. They lay down the track in just 2 takes at a blistering pace. The first was far better. It was chosen for the album. Paul had nearly ripped his vocal cords after he was finished. Geoff Emerick was confused as to why they'd started the day with this song rather than leaving it until the last. The explanation to them was simple. Paul had had years of performing this live. his throat could take the punishment. That day, the group were focused right from the start. When Paul comes into the control room afterwards, Emmerich tells him, "That vocal was incredible. You sang it even better than Little Richard." Paul, seeming pleased, replied, "Well, that's very nice of you to say so." The two were both big fans of Little Richard. Paul spoke to Emmerich about the time he met him while touring. He told Geoff Emerick Little Richard was as crazy off stage as he was on. The next time they begin, John's track titled "I Feel Fine," a simple tale of contentment through love. The narrator states he's happy and his partner is happy. The idea for the opening came from when one of John's guitars was feeding back. Other groups had played around with feedback while performing live, but the Beatles were the first group to deliberately put it onto record. The riff, as stated, came into John's head while they were recording 8 days a week. He kept playing the riff and stated he'd make an entire song from it. During recording, John breaks one of the strings of his guitar. He shouts out for Mal Evans, who always changed the strings, but that day, Mel wasn't there. Neil Aspinall was covering for him, and he instead walked over to change them. Neil was much smaller in build and height than Mal, and when John saw him, he joked, "God, Mal, you've shrank in the wash." This song is chosen to be the group's next single. With the song finished, the group now began asking for cups of tea. The problem was, it was Sunday, so the canteen was closed. Assistants were sent out to get tea and fish and chips. While the supplies were being gathered, the group began their next song, Paul's composition, "I'll Follow the Sun." The song, a story of putting yourself through difficult times in order to achieve success. The narrator knowing if he stays in the position he's in, it will bring unhappiness. Paul had wrote the song when he was 16 years old. They ran through 8 takes of the song that day. They couldn't decide on a fitting drum beat, so Paul requested Ringo slap his knees in time to the tune. Norman Smith mic'd up Ringo's legs and turned up the EQ in the control room. For the chorus, George Martin came up with a low harmony for John that complemented Paul. John added the solo on acoustic guitar. George Harrison was in a bad mood at this point. With nothing to do, he marched into the control room and snapped loudly, "You know, I'd like to do the solo on this one. I'm supposed to be the lead guitarist in this band after all." George Martin, in order to keep the peace, allowed George Harrison to play the solo. Harrison played a simple single note solo on electric. No one was too pleased with the result, not even George Harrison. Afterwards, they broke for lunch when their food arrived. When they returned, they began on another cover song, Carl Perkins' "Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby." In the song, the narrator boasts of his popularity with countless admirers hoping to be his love interest. George Harrison had chosen the song to sing lead vocal. The song captured George's feelings towards the public's obsession with the Beatles. At this point, the session began to go downhill. The group didn't want to be there any longer. They had to be in Scotland the following day to continue touring. "Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby," recorded and completed in just one take. George, despite his mood, gave a flawless performance, solo and all. It was basically a live performance from the whole band, as for the last 2 songs of the day. George Harrison was a kind and generous person, though Geoff Emerick recalled, in the studio he always seemed to have something else on his mind other than being the Beatles' lead guitarist. He didn't often join in with John and Paul's joking around. He was very much a loner in the group. When he wrote songs, he didn't have anyone to bounce off. John would sometimes help with a lyric or a chord, but he got distracted or bored. Paul never did. Next, they begin another cover, Chuck Berry's "Rock and Roll Music." The song, a simple celebration of the genre. Other styles are dismissed throughout. It was another track the Beatles performed as far back as their Hamburg days. Time was running out in the studio, and Paul now jumps on the piano. George Harrison picks up Paul's Hofner bass. John sings the lead, and the song is again complete in one take. Final song they record that day, a Buddy Holly cover, "Words of Love." The song is an idea. Love is most powerful through spoken word rather than grand gestures. The group had begun performing this a year previous. It was the first and only time a Buddy Holly song would appear on a Beatles album. John, Paul and George harmonise through the verses. They go through 3 takes, with number 2 being the best. It ends the session at midnight. The group are pleased with what they've done that day. George Harrison enters the control room, proud of his vocals on "Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby." He left that day, going through the pockets of his coat, humming the song. The group set off for Scotland the next day. While they continue touring, George Martin and Norman Smith mix the songs. 8 days later, the group gets some time off touring. This is used to continue recording. First composition this day they begin is another Carl Perkins song, "Honey Don't." The narrator feels frustrated due to his partner's mixed messages. A growing uncertainty of the relationship is present throughout. For their live performances, John would sing lead, but for the studio recording, Ringo takes the vocal. Ringo needed 1 song per album. This was chosen to be the one. In 5 takes, it was perfected, with the 5th being the best. Although George Harrison was named the Quiet Beatle, this title should have been given to Ringo. He seldom spoke, just listened, provided a beat, a silent diplomat. Though when he did speak and add musical input, it was taken seriously. The others knew if he was suggesting something, it was important, otherwise he wouldn't have said anything. Ringo was never what you'd call an outgoing person. He was more introverted, though he could be quick-witted and charming. With the album complete, the group decided to scrap the finished "What You Doing" they'd recorded back in September and re-record it. The song finished, they're now satisfied, and the record is complete. Before they can leave the studio though, there's the matter of their annual Christmas record for their fan club. Free to all members, it's issued in mid-December. They record themselves singing Christmas carols in a comical style and add a wacky improvised speech. The Beatles for Sale was released on the 4th of December. The album would be the opposite to their previous in every way. Hard Day's Night was packed with original material with a theme of confidence, high energy and excitement. For Sale borrowed heavily on covers to fill out the record with a theme of self-doubt, fatigue and awkwardness. As mentioned, John and Paul had struggled when considering compositions for the album, but this was purely because they were always attempting to evolve. They weren't trying to replicate their previous hits and churn them out. They were experimenting beyond normal pop while treading carefully not to alienate their listeners. The album, introspective and stripped down, is to this day considered their weakest. Earlier in the year, the group were going for a personal change. Bob Dylan had introduced them to marijuana, and they had now began using it frequently. It soon began to creep into their working life. It affected their next film project and shifted their songwriting inwards, inspiring them to rethink music itself. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, and if you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated. Just click the 3 symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and choose however much you wish to donate. Everything donated goes directly back into the channel to make better quality videos. As always, thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next video.